Peter Schiff. Peter, it is so good to have you back on America's Forum.
It's good to be back.
And Peter, we always seem to hear this, especially when the stories come from the Associated Press and others who, quite frankly, should know better. They turn into cheerleaders for this administration saying, oh, look at the growth of jobs. But the way we determine the unemployment numbers is fraught in curious accounting from Washington, to say the least. Give us your take on the reality out there.
Well, first of all, in April, almost 1 million Americans left the labor force in 1 month. I think that's the largest exodus from the labor force since they began keeping the statistics. The labor force participation rate dropped all the way down to 62.8. That's the lowest since 1978. So more than 3.5 times as many people left the labor force as got jobs. And the 280-odd thousand jobs that were created, better than 80% of them potentially were just made up by the government, because over 240,000 of the jobs were the result of the birth-death assumptions, where the government simply assumes that new businesses were created in April and that they hired people. But they don't have any actual proof that any of this happened. And I think it's the statisticians at the Bureau of Labor Department. Everybody assumed that people hired more people in April because the weather got better. And I think that bias made its way into those assumptions. So I don't even believe the 280,000 jobs being created. I think we actually created less than that. Meanwhile, if you actually look at the character of the jobs, they're mostly in low-paying, service sector type jobs, part-time jobs, temporary jobs. They're not legitimate jobs where you can support a family, pay a mortgage. They're not indicative of a growing economy, but of a weakening economy.
So it's important to really amplify this, Peter, given your background in this. And you talk about, I've described it earlier as it's almost Chicago Cook County accounting. What we see on Election Day in the political machine of Chicago seems to have been that methodology of accounting has come to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Now, is this something deliberately set up by a political shop, or is there any, quote, sound science in the economic assumptions these analysts and statisticians are making about these reports?
No, it's not science. It's more like propaganda. The government wants to report more favorable economic numbers than is actually the case, because they want us to believe the economy is in better shape than it really is. And part of the illusion is the stock market or the real estate market, by keeping interest rates artificially low and inflating asset prices, it makes us think that we're richer. The government can pretend that we're richer, but average Americans are feeling poor because they have to live in the real world. They don't live in the fantasy world created by the government. They actually have to pay the rising prices for food, the rising prices for electricity, insurance, and everything else. And they have a lousy job. Maybe they have no job, or they have a part-time job where they used to have a full-time job. The only way they can make ends meet is by going deeper and deeper into debt. That's why the savings rate is plunging as Americans are drowning in debt, just trying to maintain a diminishing standard of living.
So how should Americans be responding to this news?
Well, I don't know how they should respond to it. I mean, they shouldn't believe the headlines. But what we need to do is we need to change the leadership in this country, because all that we're doing now is digging the hole deeper. We have to recognize that the economy is not getting better, that nothing that the Federal Reserve has done has made the situation better, nothing that Congress or the president has done. We need to start reversing all these policies that are creating the problems. We need to start eliminating government, cutting the size of government, repealing regulations and rolling back taxes and eliminating government spending so we can free up the economy, so we can unshackle it from government.
Peter, you mentioned in that litany of symptoms we're confronting right now, you mentioned interest rates. Want your take on it? Are we going to see any increase in interest rates? Is the Fed going to take any action like that in the not too distant future?
The Fed is going to keep interest rates at zero as long as it can get away with it, which means they're going to do it until there's a crisis. I believe we're going to have a currency crisis, a sovereign debt crisis that is ultimately going to force the Fed to do the right thing. But unfortunately, they will have waited far too long to do it. and we're going to have to suffer a lot more because of the Fed's incompetence. See, what the Fed has tried to do is postpone the day of reckoning with its cheap money policies. But in so doing, they've exacerbated all of the problems that make that day of reckoning necessary. Only now we have a lot more problems to reckon with. So thanks to the Fed, it's going to be much, much worse.
What about this talk about a possible another housing bubble?
Well, we've already got one. You know, we've got another housing bubble. We've got another stock market bubble. The problem is we've got them going on simultaneously. And the biggest bubble of them all is in the bond market. All three of these bubbles are going to pop. And when they do, the fallout is going to be much greater than what we experienced in 2000 or 2008 when the other bubbles burst.
So Peter, what you're suggesting here is a meltdown of biblical proportions. I mean, if all these bubbles burst simultaneously, it's not going to be a happy day for any of us. Is there anything from your vantage point we ought to be doing? Yes, we need to change people in government. We understand that. But here and now, for Americans struggling, trying to make ends meet, trying to find work, give us your prescription for surviving this type of economic calamity.
Well, I don't know if it's going to be biblical. I mean, it's not, you know, Sodom and Gomorrah.
Okay, that's good. That's a relief, Peter.
But it certainly could be worse than what we've experienced in the United States, even including the era of the Great Depression. So I think people have to be prepared, especially if we end up with runaway inflation, hyperinflation that destroys the value of our currency. I mean, other people have lived through this in other countries, but we haven't experienced it here in America. Unfortunately, it's something that we might be experiencing. And investors, savers need to be prepared now for what's going to happen. I mean, that's part of the premise of my book, The Real Crash, America's Coming Bankruptcy, How to Save Yourself and Your Country, where I am helping people and helping my clients at Euro Pacific Capital get rid of their dollars, accumulate foreign assets, commodities, precious metals, things that the Federal Reserve can't create, because when they destroy the value of the dollar in their effort to artificially prop up everything else, it's the dollar that's the collateral damage, and people who are dependent on the dollar, people who are depending on retiring and living off the income from their investments. If all they've got is dollars, it's going to be a very short retirement. They're going to have to work because they're not going to be able to buy very much with the money they saved.
So that's what I was just asking you, though, earlier when I said, you know, how should people prepare for this?
Yeah, they need to get rid of dollars. That means, you know, cash in your CDs or sell your treasuries or your muni bonds, move money offshore. You know, we're investing in countries where central banks aren't acting as recklessly, where the people are saving and producing, where you have better economic fundamentals. Buy gold and silver. I mean, the prices are dramatically undervalued. I think we're going to have a return to sound money. I think ultimately the solution to our problems is going to involve a remonetization of gold. But by the time they remonetize it, the price is going to be substantially higher than it is now.
So from your vantage point, again, just to amplify, precious metals, specifically gold, needs to be part of this plan for economic survival.
People need to buy gold, and, you know, foreign dividend paying stocks or things that we're doing. We're, you know, looking at the Asian markets. There are a lot of countries that are doing it right. You know, we're consuming a lot in America, but the stuff that we're consuming had to be produced someplace. I want to invest in the productive economies that are making all the stuff, not the, you know, the economies that are simply squandering their wealth to consume.
Hey, we got about a minute and a half left, Peter, and a bunch of folks are going to go through what you and I went through and Miranda went through years ago. That is graduating from college. Now, with the picture you've painted economically, what on earth should college graduates keep in mind when they try to enter the workforce later this summer?
You know, I don't envy a lot of the college grads. You know, they've been led down this path with false promises from the government. I think a lot of the people who went to college would have been better off skipping college. They really had no reason to be there. They overpaid for worthless degrees. They majored in these liberal arts courses where they have no real practical relevance to the job market. Meanwhile, now they're graduating 5, 6 years older than when they graduated high school. They're tens of thousands of dollars in debt, and they don't know anything, and they're graduating to an economy that's been destroyed by big government.
And it would appear that as we've discussed all these different bubbles, there's the higher education bubble as well. Peter Schiff, another topic we'll amplify on another day. We thank you for your input and for your analysis on this Friday afternoon.
And thank you. Have a good weekend.
You too. Have a great weekend and not such a great time ahead economically, Miranda.
Yeah.
According to Peter, what do you think? We'd love to get your comments via social media. Why don't you tweet us at Newsmax TV, #America's Forum. We're coming right back.